Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the extraordinary toughness and quiet heroism of medieval peasants. The people who, against all odds, managed to make it through some of the harshest, coldest nights in history. From clever insulation hacks to the power of community warmth, their survival was a masterclass in grit, creativity, and pure determination. So before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe only if you truly enjoy the content. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see this little community gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, cozy background noise, and let's ease ourselves into tonight's story. When people picture the medieval era, they usually imagine knights charging into battle, overflowing feast tables, or cheerful festivals. But for common folk, winter wasn't festive. It was more like a yearly exam in how do we survive until sunrise. A relentless test of endurance handed out by nature, the strictest teacher of all. Imagine this. You're living in a cramped wooden hut, built with such thin walls that you could probably hear a squirrel breathing outside. Insulation? None. Windows? Just a tiny opening covered with animal hide. And definitely no thermostat arguments with your siblings. Indoors, the temperature hovered barely above whatever misery was happening outside. If it was freezing out there, it was slightly less freezing inside. Yay, progress. Nights were the real challenge. Darkness swallowed the world. The wind wailed like a furious spirit circling the house. The hearth fire crackled weakly, trying its best, but only managing to toast the toes of whoever sat closest. If you were across the room? Too bad. You might as well have been sleeping outdoors, but with fewer snacks. Clothes didn't offer much mercy either. No luxurious fur-lined coats, no fluffy goose-down bedding. Just a couple of coarse wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled a little too much like its former animal owner, and the desperate hope that layering everything you owned would magically help. Spoiler, it didn't. Beds were usually sacks stuffed with straw or hay, maybe mixed with old twigs just for fun, plus fleas, who apparently refused to hibernate. Medieval comfort at its finest. The cold wasn't just unpleasant, it could kill. Frostbite, hypothermia, and simply freezing in your sleep were very real threats, especially for elders and young kids. Waking up alive each morning was basically a small blessing, enough reason to celebrate with a slightly less icy turnip for breakfast. Surviving a medieval winter had nothing to do with being cozy. It was about bracing yourself, layering every scrap of fabric you owned, squeezing in beside your animals for warmth, and hoping you didn't wake up with frost forming on your face. And honestly, that was only the start of the struggle. If you think your apartment feels chilly because the window doesn't shut all the way, a medieval peasant would have gladly traded homes with you. Their houses weren't just slightly drafty. They were practically enthusiastic wind tunnels disguised as dwellings. Most ordinary people lived in structures built using what historians refer to as wattle-and-daub. In simple terms, this meant wooden sticks woven like an enormous basket and then coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and, yes, animal dung. The dung wasn't used to disgust anyone. It simply worked as a cheap binder that stuck well to the wooden frame and was always available. But even with careful application, those walls were no match against a real winter storm. Cold air slipped through every opening, rushed along the interior walls, and filled the entire space with icy drafts. Staying warm was nearly impossible, and privacy didn't exist in a single-room house. There was no such thing as a cozy corner. There were only areas that were slightly less cold. The roofs didn't help much either. Thatched roofs may look charming in pictures, but months of rain, snow, and heavy wind left them drooping, dripping, and sometimes hosting small creatures. A quiet evening could be interrupted by a mouse or squirrel dropping in from above, literally. Windows, if the home had them, were tiny slits covered with stretched animal hide or simple shutters. Glass was a luxury found only in the wealthiest homes, and even lords rarely had more than a tiny piece of it. Peasants were satisfied if the covering on their wall didn't blow away during a storm. The floors offered little comfort too. Most houses had nothing more than packed earth beneath their feet. After intense rain or snow, water seeped upward through the soil, turning parts of the interior into muddy patches. In winter, every step inside felt like crossing a cold, damp field. The chill came from below, from above, and from all sides. A full-scale, three-directional attack on anyone trying to stay warm. Despite all this, medieval peasants didn't complain much. They worked with what they had. They plugged wall gaps with moss, stuffed old cloth into the worst drafts, and sat together as closely as possible to preserve body heat. This combination of practical problem-solving, determination, and sometimes even rubbing greasy animal fat into the walls was often the only thing preventing them from turning into frozen statues. If your home was falling apart and your best line of defense against winter involved livestock and layers of wool, sometimes all you could do was find humor in the situation, assuming your jaw wasn't shaking too much to laugh. As if above-ground cold wasn't challenging enough, peasants also had to deal with the chill creeping upward from the ground below. Their floors were simply leveled-out patches of dirt inside the house, offering no insulation. This meant the frozen earth beneath their feet continuously pushed cold air upward, adding yet another source of discomfort to an already harsh living environment. If you were fortunate, someone might have scattered a layer of straw or old rushes across the floor, giving the tiniest impression of comfort. But let's be clear, you were still only a thin cushion away from the cold, unyielding dirt beneath you. And that cold never let up. It crept upward from the ground like a determined little spirit, slipping through the straw, sinking into your bones, and settling deep within you. Anything you accidentally dropped onto the floor on a winter night, consider it permanently frozen to the ground. Medieval peasants did try to push back against this harsh reality. One method involved spreading thick piles of straw over the dirt. If you had the means, or more commonly, if you managed to borrow enough straw from a neighbor's field without being noticed, you might create a half-decent insulating layer. But straw didn't stay fluffy for long. It flattened quickly, went moldy even quicker, and added a loud, crackling underfoot that accompanied every miserable movement in the dark. Some households used dried rushes instead. Periodically, they would toss fresh rushes on top without removing the old ones. Over time, this built up into a layered habitat of rotting plant material, fleas, and various small creatures that wandered in. It was, in essence, the medieval version of carpet padding, if that padding happened to be damp, alive, and smelling faintly of wet animals. Beds, for those lucky enough to own them, weren't much better. Most were simple wooden frames stuffed with, predictably, layers of hay or straw. Instead of soft mattresses, peasants slept on uneven, crunchy bedding that shifted beneath them and did almost nothing to shield them from the cold radiating up from the ground. Restless tossing wasn't for comfort. It was a necessary attempt to keep circulation going and prevent one side of the body from going numb from the cold. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't overcome the freezing ground. They simply endured it. A good night's sleep had nothing to do with pleasant dreams or comfort. It meant waking up with all your fingers and toes intact. If you managed that, you were already ahead of many others. And if there was one thing in a medieval home that could be called the hero of winter, it wasn't the walls, the roof, or the desperate layers of mud and dung insulation. It was the hearth, the stubborn, glowing fire at the center of the home that stood as the only dependable defense against the bitter chill. Nearly every peasant dwelling revolved around this flame. It wasn't a fireplace with carved stonework or a well-built chimney. Instead, it was usually nothing more than a small pit lined with stones, a few partially burned logs, and enough smoke to make you wonder if you were being slowly smoked like a piece of meat. Most homes didn't have chimneys at all. The smoke simply drifted, lingered, and tried, often unsuccessfully, to find its way out through any cracks or holes it could. The smoke didn't politely rise upward like you'd hope. Instead, it wandered out through tiny gaps in the roof, slithered through the cracks in the walls, or, on particularly lazy evenings, drifted straight into your lungs. Not exactly ideal for your health or your long-term survival, but it did help drive out fleas and other pests. Who needs an exterminator when you're being slow roasted in your own home? But the hearth was more than just a heater. It was the stove, the lamp, and sometimes the medieval equivalent of a family entertainment system. After sunset, everyone would gather around the fire to swap stories, whisper gossip, or simply gaze into the flames, mostly because there wasn't much else to do. And keeping that fire going wasn't optional. Letting it die overnight was practically an invitation for winter's icy grip to sweep in and finish the job the cold had started. Starting a fire again in the middle of winter wasn't a matter of striking a match. Matches didn't exist. Instead, you had flint, steel, a handful of kindling, and the kind of frantic prayers normally reserved for near-death situations. Every family member contributed, tending the coals, feeding the flames, tossing on twigs, or if fortune smiled, a rare dry log. It was a nightly contest between stubborn humans and a winter determined to snuff out every spark. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival wasn't happening at all. It was smoky, fickle, and often disappointing, but in a medieval winter, it was the one flicker of hope they had. If there was anything peasants dreaded more than running out of ale, it was the fire dying before morning. Without that warm glow, the cold invaded faster than a tax collector after harvest. And trying to restart a fire in the pitch-black freeze wasn't just a nuisance, it could be fatal. No matches, no lighters, just raw determination, clumsy frozen fingers, and a desperate attempt to coax sparks from flint and steel while the night howled around you. Sometimes literally, if wolves were nearby. So people got clever. They banked the fire, not in a savings account. This kind of banking meant tucking the embers under a thick layer of ash before bed. The ash worked like insulation, trapping just enough heat to keep the coals alive until dawn. If all went well, you could shuffle over in the morning, nudge the ash aside, add a bit of fuel, and there it was, a revived fire without losing chunks of your fingertips to frostbite. Of course, if you messed up the process, your morning instantly turned colder, and your mood followed. Fire banking wasn't just a chore. It was a skill handed down through generations like a treasured household secret. Every family had its own perfect method. Some swore by using only bone-dry ash, while others insisted a little moisture kept the heat in better. Some tightly packed the embers. Others preferred leaving gaps so the coals could breathe. Suggest a different method and you'd spark a medieval debate faster than you could blink. It was basically the old-time version of arguing about the right way to grill meat. Except the consequences were a bit more serious than burnt dinner. And even with all that effort, banking the fire didn't always guarantee success. A strong wind might slip through a crack and smother the coals, or a wandering sheep could blunder into the hearth and in the heat for everyone. Yes, that actually happened. That's why many families took turns waking up at night to check on the embers, the medieval equivalent of stumbling half asleep to adjust the thermostat. In the end, the goal wasn't control. It was simply buying a few more hours of precious warmth. If you woke up and found even one glowing coal still alive, that was a small miracle, and enough motivation to face another ice-bitten day. In those days, the more the merrier wasn't a party slogan. It was a winter survival rule. When the fire dimmed and icy drafts knifed through the house, there was only one guaranteed heat source: other warm bodies. And if that meant piling together with your entire family, a neighbor or two, the livestock, and perhaps one deeply bewildered goose, nobody complained. Forget personal space. Privacy wasn't even on the menu during the coldest nights. The mission was simple: don't wake up frozen to the ground. Households squeezed into the warmest corner, wrapped in whatever fabric scraps they could scavenge, forming something that looked suspiciously like a layered, snoring human casserole. Younger children were tucked in the center, adults huddled around them, and elderly relatives curled along the edges. If Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly seeking warmth, there was always a way to shove her in. Landing in the middle was prime real estate, surrounded by shared heat on all sides. Getting stuck on the outer edge, however, was the medieval equivalent of sleeping beside the open door of a walk-in freezer. And heaven help the person who wriggled too much during the night. Shifting even an inch could unleash a domino wave of complaints. Shift your position even a little, trying to get comfortable, and suddenly poor Aunt Maud is shoved straight into the icy draft seeping through the wall. Congratulations, you've officially become the villain of the household. Many families didn't just share blankets. They shared the same flattened communal straw mattress that had been squashed by generations of sleepers. And since medieval cleanliness wasn't exactly top tier, the whole setup had a scent that could politely be described as memorable. But when it's a choice between an unpleasant smell or losing a toe to frostbite, your standards drop real fast. Body heat wasn't simply comforting, it was tactical. Some medieval survival advice even suggested lining up the toughest, warmest people on the outside like human insulation panels. Babies, elderly relatives, and anyone fragile got tucked deep in the middle, the cherished, pint-sized engines of warmth. And over time, this nightly snuggle fest became more than a strategy. It became a winter tradition. Long, cold nights crammed together meant stories being swapped, songs sung softly into the dark, and probably a whole lot of whispered gossip beneath the blankets. So the next time your sibling steals your duvet or your dog monopolizes the mattress, remember, at least you're not fighting for space between a snoring uncle and a goat silently judging your life choices. If you think modern flatmates are difficult, medieval peasants had an entirely different brand of winter roommates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything warm, alive, and not actively biting. This wasn't some charming village quirk, it was pure survival logic. Animals radiated heat, and in homes where the wind blew harder than your will to live, every extra degree made a difference. Plus, if your goat was sleeping next to you, it was slightly less likely to wander off or mysteriously disappear into a neighbor's stew pot. Practical and toasty, by nightfall, the house turned into a living, breathing furnace of chaos. Chickens roost in corners. Pigs grunted near the fire. Cows leaned against the walls like they owned the place. It was about as glamorous as being locked in a car with someone who hasn't showered in a week. Except that someone is a full-sized farm animal and it's the dead of winter. And the smell? Legendary. By the time spring rolled around, the aroma of a shared animal-packed winter didn't just linger, it attacked. No candles needed. Your nose didn't stand a chance in a medieval winter home. Still, peasants learned to tune out the ever-present barnyard aroma because they understood one crucial fact. More animals indoors meant fewer frostbitten feet in the morning. And some creatures even got top-tier seating. Cows, being the biggest heaters in the house, usually claimed the cozy central zone near the family. Goats were welcomed close too, both for warmth and because, let's be honest, goats would sneak in whether you allowed them or not. Chickens took to the rafters or nestled in battered baskets, while pigs didn't have preferences. They'd flop down smack in the middle of the room like they paid rent. Of course, sharing your sleeping space with half a farm came with certain risks. Picture drifting off nicely only to wake up because a chicken decided your head makes an excellent perch. Or stepping, barefoot, into something deeply suspicious before breakfast. Yes, medieval mornings were full of surprises. But despite the stench, the clatter, and the occasional hoof jab to the ribs, peasants knew the math by heart. Cold is deadly, and cows radiate heat whether they feel like helping or not. In the fight against winter's icy grip, the warm, slightly damp breath of a cow could be the thin line between survival and disaster. As for winter fashion, it wasn't about style, it was about staying alive. Medieval peasants weren't browsing fashion plates. They were suiting up like warriors preparing for a showdown with the cold itself. The rule of thumb was simple. If you owned a garment, you put it on. All of it. First came the undertunic, usually made of scratchy, questionably clean linen. Over that went a thick wool tunic. Then another. Add some baggy leggings that sagged around the knees, a coarse cloak thrown across your shoulders, and if fortune smiled on you, a patched sheepskin coat layered on top like a badge of honor. Congratulations, you were marginally warmer and significantly itchier. Footwear? That was luxury territory. Most peasants wrapped their feet in strips of cloth or whatever rags they could find, then shoved the bundle into clunky wooden clogs. If the cold still gnawed at your toes, You added more rags and hoped you wouldn't discover a missing digit come morning. As for washing these layers, that was a winter nightmare. Cleaning clothes meant hauling them to a frozen stream, hacking through the ice, and then waiting days for your one decent shirt to thaw and dry, assuming it didn't freeze into a shirt-shaped sculpture first. So peasants made the practical choice. Smelling like a blend of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not turning into a human icicle. Surprisingly, the layers of dirt and grease that coated medieval clothing came with an unexpected benefit: insulation. That thick, grimy coating acted like a primitive weatherproof shell, trapping warmth the way a modern jacket might, only far smellier and absolutely not something anyone today would endorse. In those days, hats, scarves, and gloves weren't fashion statements. They were lifelines. A simple wool cap could be the difference between surviving the night and waking up with your hair frozen solid against the nearest wall. Gloves were usually stitched together from scraps of leather or leftover cloth, often resembling lopsided puppets more than actual accessories. Children were bundled so enthusiastically that they ended up resembling overfilled turnips. Waddling around under layers meant to keep every last bit of heat from escaping. Style wasn't a concern. Refinement didn't exist. Warmth was the only priority, and if you looked like a walking laundry pile, well, that was simply the mark of someone who intended to make it through winter. So before you grumble about needing an extra sweater today, remember, medieval peasants routinely wore every garment they owned at the same time and considered themselves fortunate. In the medieval survival manual, dirt was more than an inconvenience. It was practically a strategy. Going unwashed wasn't laziness, it was calculated. Winter came with a particular challenge: preventing heat from escaping. Freshly washed clothes, especially linen, were notoriously poor at holding warmth. Breathable fabric might sound comfortable now, but when temperatures hovered somewhere between "this stings" and "my soul is leaving my body," breathability was more curse than blessing. This is where dirt earned its unexpected respect. As peasants went weeks or months without washing, layers of mud, sweat, oils, and everyday grime built up on their clothing. Slowly, these natural coatings filled the tiny gaps in the fabric, turning tunics, cloaks, and leggings into makeshift wind blockers. It was like medieval waterproofing, but with a scent that could knock out a small farm animal. Still, it worked. You might smell questionable, but you stayed warm, and warmth trumped dignity every time. Some medieval people even believed that bathing in winter was dangerous, claiming it weakened the body or made illness more likely. Better to preserve your protective layer of holy grime than risk washing it away. Baths were rare events, laundry rarer still. Soap was precious and saved for important moments, like receiving a visit from someone important or preparing for death. On top of that, peasants layered their garments without removing the ones beneath. The buildup of clothing, and everything accumulating on those clothes, formed a barrier against the brutal winds. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them alive. Instead of removing yesterday's clothes, medieval peasants simply layered new garments over whatever they were already wearing. Over time, their outfits transformed into a living archive of the previous month and a half. Every mark, smudge, and streak becoming a souvenir of daily survival. That mysterious brown stain? A reminder of the time you slipped in the mud but lived to tell the tale. Outsiders might have assumed peasants had abandoned all hope of cleanliness, but they understood the truth perfectly well. That gritty, stiff, dirt-encrusted tunic wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a protective thermal barrier standing between them and the icy grip of frostbite. Dignity was optional. Warmth was not. And really, why worry about offending anyone when the entire village carried the same overpowering bouquet of smoke, sweat, livestock, and unwashed wool? At some point, everyone's noses simply gave up. Olfactory surrender became a universal coping mechanism. So yes, during medieval winters, filth wasn't a failure. It was a strategy. It was survival. It was the practical man's winter coat. And if, by mid-February, you'd managed to cultivate a thick, greasy, weatherproof crust on your outer layers, congratulations. You were thriving by medieval standards. If you're imagining medieval peasants drifting off to sleep in fluffy feather beds beneath embroidered blankets, let's correct that right now. The real picture was much simpler. And by simpler, we mean primitive. Beds, when a family was fortunate enough to have them, consisted of a rough wooden frame covered by a large cloth sack stuffed with straw, hay, or dried rushes. That was the entire setup. No luxurious cushioning, no ergonomic design, no plush fabrics, just a crunchy, uneven, mildly itchy bundle of dried plants that smelled faintly of animals and faintly of despair. Every shift in position during the night produced a symphony of crackles and rustles, paired with the occasional jab of a stray straw stalk poking through the sack like it had a personal grudge. Many peasants didn't even bother with the frame. They simply tossed straw directly onto the packed dirt floor, creating what could generously be described as a ground-level sleeping arrangement. Today, someone on the internet would probably market it as earth-rooted minimalist sleeping. But back then, it was just what you did when comfort came second to cost. And these straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. With constant use, the straw flattened into a sad, compact mat, absorbed moisture, developed mold, and attracted an entire ecosystem of bugs. Changing out your bedding was an event, often done only a few times a year. Some families waited until their mattress began to move on its own before deciding it was time for new stuffing. Rushes were another option. These long, reed-like plants were spread generously over the floor and sometimes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rosemary to cover the ever-present aroma of livestock and unwashed humanity. The fresh rushes offered a brief moment of pleasant fragrance, a single day of floral optimism, before they blended into the muddy, trampled mixture of dirt, spilled food, stray feathers, and whatever else wandered indoors during daily life. And of course, we can't ignore the other little companions peasants shared their sleep with. Fleas, lice, and all sorts of tiny freeloaders adored straw beds just as much as the humans did. If you spent the night itching more than resting, congratulations. You were living the true medieval lifestyle. Still, uncomfortable as they were, those scratchy heaps of straw were literal lifesavers. They created a warm buffer between the body and the freezing ground, and when everyone huddled together on top of them, pockets of shared warmth formed. That was medieval central heating in all its glory. So the next time you melt into your cushy, perfectly engineered mattress, remember, somewhere in the timeline, a medieval peasant is peering at you with a gap-toothed grin and thinking, must be nice. When your home is basically sticks, mud, and sheer hope glued together, winter drafts stop being mild annoyances and turn into personal vendettas. Medieval villagers didn't only battle the cold outdoors, they waged war against the chill inside their own homes, armed with whatever scraps they could shove into the endless cracks. And believe me, the cracks were everywhere. Walls buckled, mud flaked off, thatch sagged, and every night the cold discovered a brand new entry point, like some spiteful spirit with too much free time. Blocking out the wind became a full-time craft. People stuffed gaps with moss, straw, old fabric, dried grasses, even tufts of animal hair. If it was soft, squishable, or capable of slowing a breeze, it got shoved into a hole. Some especially determined households plastered extra layers of mud and dung onto their walls each winter. Picture standing outside in the freezing cold, smacking icy manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is luxurious." And honestly, compared to freezing, it was. Then there were the roof leaks. Thatch was affordable and abundant, but waterproof? Not so much. After a few winters, it practically invited the rain in. To plug gaps, peasants jammed in pieces of cloth, handfuls of reeds, or, in moments of desperation, chunks of turf swiped from a nearby field. Eventually, every cottage resembled a weary, mismatched quilt patched together by someone who lost motivation halfway through. Doors and windows weren't much better, but that's another story entirely. If you had doors and windows at all, consider yourself fortunate. Even then, they were usually nothing more than rough wooden boards clinging to the house thanks to iron nails and pure determination. Window openings were often covered with animal skins or thick cloth soaked in fat, blocking the worst of the wind while adding a lovely lingering scent of mystery stew to the entire room. Every night became a showdown between human creativity and the relentless, creeping cold. One moment you'd feel comfortably warm, and the next, a rogue draft would snake through the one gap you didn't notice, smacking you awake like winter itself had slapped you across the face. Still, through grit, inventiveness, and an absolute refusal to live in a state of semi-freezing, medieval villagers plugged, patched, and packed their homes until spring returned, one handful of mud at a time. And when the cold grew so bitter it stole your sleep, peasants turned to their trusty solution. Don't even try to have everyone sleep at once. Instead, they created an accidental system that would impress any military strategist, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't coordinated with signals or schedules. It was more like organized desperation. Half the family stayed awake to watch the fire and stuff stray gaps, while the others burrowed under worn blankets and piles of hay, grabbing a few precious hours of half-thawed rest. The fire was the center of survival, and it demanded constant babysitting. If left alone, it would sputter out, and restarting it was about as pleasant as convincing a stubborn mule to tap dance. So someone always had to be on ember duty. Families rotated responsibility. You'd catch a bit of sleep, get shaken awake, then shuffle over to the hearth to jab, poke, and mumble curses at the fading flames, all while avoiding a wandering goat in the dark. This rotation system was anything but glamorous. No gadgets, no snacks, no snooze buttons, just stiff limbs, aching eyes, and simmering annoyance toward whoever snored through your watch. Any child capable of holding a stick got drafted into service, learning early that winter was a team effort or everyone risked freezing. Grandparents often lingered near the fire longer, partly because they knew what they were doing, and partly because getting down and back up again was an epic ordeal thanks to creaky joints. And when you finally got your turn to lie down, good luck. People pacing, animals shifting, the wind hammering the walls, and a sibling elbowing you in their sleep ensured that truly restful slumber was nothing short of a miracle. And somehow, even with everyone half asleep and thoroughly miserable, the system kept households alive. Taking turns staying awake ensured that someone was always there to nurse the fire along with stiff fingers and pure determination. The coals endured, and because of that, the family made it through another night. So the next time you groan about getting up to tweak the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a moment for the medieval villager squinting at a dying flame at 3 a.m., quietly debating whether toes were truly essential for survival. You know the cold is serious when even breathing becomes a strategic decision. Medieval peasants didn't just rely on cloaks, burning logs, and communal sleeping arrangements. They managed the very way they inhaled air. The issue was straightforward. Deep breaths, especially through the mouth, dragged icy air straight into the lungs. And in an era where pneumonia could send you to the afterlife faster than you could mutter, "Amen," no one was eager to take that gamble. So people adapted. They mastered what we might call medieval survival breathing. Instead of gulping down air like exhausted runners, they took shallow, steady breaths, always through the nose. This warmed the air slightly before it reached the lungs, offering a small but crucial layer of protection. It wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than coughing yourself into oblivion. By the time late winter rolled around, one accidental deep mouth breath was enough to earn you a week-long coughing fit that felt like your soul was trying to exit your body. Without doctors, you'd end up relying on whatever cure grandma concocted. Usually hot onion tea and prayers firm enough to shake the rafters. To help avoid the frigid air entirely, some people would pull parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces at night, creating a primitive heat-trapping mask. Sure, you'd wake up with a damp, clammy piece of fabric stuck to your face, but that was still preferable to freezing your lungs from the inside. Kids learned these tricks early. Parents would lecture them for gasping like puppies indoors during winter, because one wrong breath could land them in bed for a week. Between controlled breathing lessons, scratchy wool outfits, and sleeping beside a goat with digestive issues, medieval childhood truly forged character. At night, bundled into straw beds beneath piles of cloaks and nestled beside a pleasantly warm cow, breathing became a delicate discipline, slow, careful, nose only, and as minimal as possible. Picture a grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, but with more frostbite and far fewer motivational sayings. In the Greater Handbook of Not Dying in Winter, it wasn't the most dramatic tactic, but it was one of the ones that kept people alive. One small, careful breath at a time, medieval peasants pushed through another night in their never-ending struggle with winter. And in that icy war, they stumbled upon an unexpected ally, a very full belly. As it turned out, one of the most effective ways to stay warm wasn't piling on another itchy wool layer. It was eating something dense and filling right before sleeping. More food meant more warmth. The harder the body had to work to digest a meal, the more heat it produced. Basic medieval science. Eat something heavy, let your insides heat up while doing the work, and hope you make it to dawn without becoming a human icicle. So what exactly did peasants shovel into their bowls before a freezing night? Thick, hearty stews loaded with root vegetables, onions, turnips, parsnips, anything that grew underground and refused to die. Grains were the real winter champions too. Oat porridge, barley mush, tough rye bread that doubled as a weapon if necessary. If fortune smiled upon you, like after a feast day or a slaughter, you might even score a piece of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage tossed into the pot. This was not comfort cuisine by any modern standard. No decorations, no herbs sprinkled on top. Just one enormous, mostly brown concoction meant to sit in your stomach like a loyal brick, releasing warmth slowly through the night. It wasn't just about quantity, it was about choosing foods that digested slowly and kept the internal fire burning. Fatty ingredients were especially treasured, not only for the energy, but because fat took its sweet time breaking down. A belly full of stew, bread, and an enthusiastic amount of animal fat? That was top-tier medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even fussy children cleaned their bowls. No one cared if young Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you lay awake freezing and reconsidered all your life choices. Tough love, medieval edition. Of course, stuffing yourself before bed came with side effects. Sure, you stayed warmer, but you also risked a night of strange, feverish dreams powered by a stomach struggling heroically to digest what felt like half a farm's produce. Was it worth it? Definitely. Because peasants weren't chasing gourmet dinners, they were chasing survival. And if that meant going to sleep bloated, breathing carefully through your nose, wedged beside a warm cow, then so be it. That was winter victory. Another icy night survived, another small victory in the never-ending struggle to make it to the next sunrise. Long before heated blankets, electric pads, or anything remotely comfortable, medieval peasants had to improvise their own bedtime warmth hacks. And that's where two unlikely champions stepped in: the hay box and the ever-reliable warmed stone. Humble tools, but absolute winter lifesavers. Let's begin with the hay box. It might sound simple, and it was, but the invention was surprisingly clever. Peasants would take a solid wooden chest, pack it tightly with hay, and use it to keep earlier meals warm for long stretches. Hot porridge, stew leftover from supper? Just pop the pot into the hay-lined box, cover it, and the food stayed warm for hours without anyone needing to poke a dying fire back to life. Basically, the medieval version of a slow cooker, minus the electricity and plus a lot more hay. But peasants didn't stop with reheated dinners. If hay could hold the warmth of a stew pot, they realized it could also trap the heat of something even more useful: stones. And thus entered the age of the medieval hot water bottle, made entirely of rock. Before bedtime, someone, usually the child who lost the daily debate, would take a flat stone and toss it deep into the hottest part of the fire. After it was heated to the edge of being untouchable, they'd pull it out with a stick or a pair of battered tongs. That glowing stone was then wrapped in scraps of cloth, tucked inside a piece of old fabric, or even placed into a clay container. Once insulated, the stone was slid beneath the hay-stuffed mattress or positioned at the foot of the bed, slowly releasing glorious warmth through the night. A primitive heating pad, yes, but in a world where everything froze the moment you turned your back, it felt like magic. Of course, this trick had its hazards. Wrap the stone badly. Congratulations, you now had a small smoldering fire under your bed. Drop the hot rock. You had a fresh winter injury, and not the kind caused by slipping on snow. But when done correctly, that heated stone offered hours of gentle heat, enough to make the difference between shivering endlessly and actually falling asleep. It wasn't fancy by any means, but in a hut that spent half the year feeling like a giant icebox, luxury was simply defined as not waking up with your breath frozen in midair. And so, within the modest tool set of medieval winter survival, a warm rock tucked into a nest of hay wasn't just practical. It was a tiny miracle in a world fighting the cold every single night. The hearth wasn't just a place to boil stew or toast bread. It was practically an honorary member of the household. A moody, smoky, occasionally rebellious member, sure, but absolutely vital if you wanted to make it through the night without turning into a decorative ice sculpture. When bedtime came around, the fire wasn't just warmth. It was the deciding factor between waking up groggy or not waking up at all. Sleeping spots weren't chosen based on comfort or personal preference. They were assigned with the precision of a battlefield strategist. The frail, the elderly, the unwell, and of course babies were placed closest to the fire's glow. Everyone else arranged themselves outward from that point like layers of protective padding. Being granted a place near the hearth wasn't sentimentality. It was cold, literal survival logic. Infants were delicate little heat sources. Elders held generations of valuable knowledge. And, let's be honest, the juiciest family stories. So they were defended with prime warmth. But this prime location came with risks. Too close to the flames, and you might wake up with eyebrows noticeably shorter or find your cloak quietly smoldering. Too far away, and you might as well be sleeping outdoors. It was a nightly balancing act. Stay close enough to soak in the heat, but not so close that you ended up explaining your crispy new hairstyle in the morning. The fire also didn't distribute warmth politely. It blasted heat straight ahead and ignored everyone sitting even slightly off to the side. Those who landed in the perfect path of warmth basked like lizards in a sunbeam, while the rest fought for scraps of lukewarm air. If you fell asleep facing the fire, one half of your body felt like a toasted loaf of bread, while the other half froze stiff enough to knock on. And then, of course, came the animals, the unofficial roommates of medieval winter. Dogs saw the prime fire spot and claimed it without hesitation, often wedging themselves between you and the flames with their tails wagging dangerously close to disaster. Chickens perched on the hearthstones, puffed up and murmuring as if guarding the heat themselves. Every crackle, every spark, every slow settling of a log was a comforting reminder. You're still warm. You're still breathing. For the moment, anyway. And so peasants drifted into rough, restless sleep, the fire murmuring beside them, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold air beyond its fragile reach. It was far from luxurious. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was existence, humans clinging to warmth through sheer stubbornness and glowing embers. In the medieval world, surviving the winter was never a solo mission. Unless, of course, you didn't mind becoming a very fashionable frost sculpture by mid-January. Winter survival wasn't a solo mission in a medieval village. It was a whole community effort, a noisy, muddy, chaotic operation where everyone's warmth depended on everyone else's vigilance. People understood that no matter how bright your fire blazed or how high your haystack was, you weren't truly safe unless your neighbors were safe too. If the smoke from Old Tom's chimney stopped rising one morning, people noticed. Someone always went to check. Maybe Tom still owed you a chicken. Sure, that helped. But the real reason was simple. In winter, community meant life. Villages had their own unofficial winter lookouts. The elderly, the youngsters, or anyone unable to work the fields kept track of who was coughing too much, who hadn't shown up at the market, or which hut suddenly seemed suspiciously quiet under the frost. They were the medieval version of a neighborhood watch. No bright vests, but definitely more sheep. And if a family's fire went out, that was nearly a crisis. A good neighbor would hurry over with a smoldering ember wrapped in cloth, or, better yet, open their door and squeeze the family into their already overcrowded, smoky hut for the night. Was it comfortable? Absolutely not. But it beat discovering frozen neighbors when the thaw finally came. Communal food stores mattered too. When winters turned vicious, whole villages would combine their last scraps of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. No one had enough, but sharing the final rations could mean the difference between limping into spring or not reaching it at all. Even the children knew the risks. They ferried firewood, carried glowing coals, and sprinted between houses delivering urgent messages. No one, no matter how small or tired, was exempt when the cold tightened its grip. Of course, medieval villages weren't magically free of drama. Arguments still happened, battles over land, bickering about goats, or simmering resentment about a borrowed cooking pot that suspiciously never came back. But when the nights grew lethal and the wind howled like a living thing, many grudges quietly slipped into the background. Because everyone understood, a life was still worth saving today, since tomorrow, it might be your door where help was needed. In those brutal winters, the village transformed into a stubborn, mismatched family, sometimes dysfunctional, often amusing, but always fiercely united in the fight to stay alive. One muddy footprint, one glowing ember, one half-frozen grin at a time. Medieval peasants didn't confront winter with just cloaks and a fire. They fought it with community. Together, people prayed constantly during winter, because when the wind roared like starving wolves outside your flimsy wall of sticks and mud, and the fire dwindled into a sulky glow, you wanted every possible edge, including divine backup. Faith wasn't a once-a-week ritual. It was stitched into every trembling breath before families wriggled under piles of straw and scratchy wool. Whole households knelt together, muttering fast prayers for a steady flame, a strong roof, and toes that wouldn't freeze off before dawn. Saints weren't distant figures back then. They were the first line of winter defense. Saint Blaise, for example, was invoked to guard against throat infections. No small matter when one wrong inhale of icy air could send you coughing like you were about to expel your soul. Even Saint Nicholas, long before his jolly makeover, was asked to shield homes from disaster during the bleakest months. Superstition, religion, and survival mixed seamlessly. Some people flicked holy water near the hearth each night, hoping it chased away evil spirits, or at the very least, stopped the drafts from tormenting them. Others marked their doors with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth, luck, and a bit of mercy to drift indoors. Candles took on sacred importance too. 1 or 2 vigil candles, blessed by the priest or the village's holiest grandmother, were sometimes kept burning until morning, a trembling flame standing guard against the suffocating dark pressing in from every side. And, inevitably, there were bargains whispered into the night. Please, Lord, let us see sunrise, and I promise I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who steals our turnips. Faith wasn't poetic comfort. It was a desperate, ongoing conversation with the divine. People didn't pray for luxury, just a little warmth, a little bread, and one more day to endure, until spring finally pried winter's icy fingers from their tiny world. It was nothing more than raw hope breathed into smoky rafters, woven into frantic night prayers, and tucked beneath rough blankets that somehow helped them survive the endless, punishing nights. But for all the devotion, effort, and stubborn grit medieval peasants summoned against winter, the brutal truth lingered. Sometimes it simply wasn't enough. And when winter claimed victory, it didn't just take a handful of unfortunate souls. Winter didn't just claim individuals, it swallowed entire families, even whole villages, leaving nothing but silence under layers of ice and snow. Some seasons were vicious beyond imagination. Take the infamous famine winter of 1315. Relentless rains ruined crops, animals dropped where they stood, and the cold finished what starvation began. People grew so desperate that rumors spread of chewing on leather, stripping bark from trees, and in the bleakest stories, turning to cannibalism. Letting the hearth go out wasn't a small mistake. It was often a death sentence. Without even the faint warmth of a fire, families curled together for the last time. When spring finally melted the world, neighbors sometimes discovered entire households frozen in place, clinging to each other as if they could share one final spark of heat. Homes could collapse from the weight of snow or the force of ice storms. A roof falling in during a freezing night was swift and fatal. Trying to fight through waist-deep drifts to beg a neighbor for shelter offered no guarantees either, especially when every family was already at the edge of survival. Disease thrived in the cold. Hunger weakened the body, and cramped, smoky rooms filled with sick relatives turned into perfect traps for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other killers. A harmless cough in December could turn into a burial by January. And then came frostbite, the unsparing destroyer. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached, leaving survivors marked forever. Some lived through the winter only by sacrificing parts of themselves, grim proof of endurance. I survived, but winter took its toll. What lingers most isn't the tragedy, it's the bleak normalcy. Everyone knew that each winter would take someone. Death wasn't a surprise visitor. It was just another neighbor knocking softly, draped in frost. Yet even with all this, people pushed onward, grieving, shivering, but refusing to let go. Because as long as one ember glowed in the hearth, as long as a single breath misted in the frigid air, there was still something worth fighting for. And when we look back at those medieval peasants, muddy, frozen, coughing through the smoke, it's easy to focus only on their suffering. The cracked skin, the numb feet, the relentless cold. But buried beneath all that hardship lies something far more extraordinary, a legacy of sheer, stubborn creativity and unbreakable resilience. They had no heaters, no padded coats, no plush beds. What they had was grit and the will to endure. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of assuming they'd make it to spring. What they did possess, and what they ultimately passed down, was an enduring blueprint for resilience. Every straw-stuffed mattress, every carefully banked fire, every desperate patch of insulation in a wall stood as proof of human ingenuity in the face of relentless hardship. Confronted with near-impossible circumstances, they didn't crumble. They adapted. They learned from the land, from one another, and from the harsh lessons carved by each merciless winter. Their communities were forged not just from shared land, but from shared survival. Neighbors watched over the sick, pooled meager resources when food ran low, and trusted that aiding a freezing friend today might mean someone would come to your rescue tomorrow. Survival wasn't an individual pursuit, it was collective. Even their faith became a form of endurance. Prayer was woven into daily life, not only from fear, but from hope. A fragile, persistent hope that tomorrow might bring a slightly warmer day, a slightly brighter dawn. Hope that after countless dark, frozen nights, spring would return and life would push through the frozen soil. And somehow it did. Through their sacrifices, through small, uncelebrated victories, humanity survived. By surviving one more night, one more storm, they ensured that future generations could thrive. Step by frozen step, these ancestors pushed humanity forward, enduring winters that would have killed less stubborn souls. They lived in a world where warmth and comfort were rare luxuries, yet their blood, sweat, and clever solutions are embedded invisibly in the life we know today. Every soft blanket, every cozy hearth, every slow, lazy winter evening owes its existence to countless nameless peasants who refused to surrender to the cold. So, the next time the wind howls outside your double-glazed window, spare a thought for those forgotten heroes. Those anonymous individuals who transformed shivering survival into a living legacy, one breath, one heartbeat, one stubborn night at a time. Meanwhile, and Bullen didn't arrive in the world adorned with crowns or armies. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Bullen, a politically ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful family connections. In the rigid hierarchy of Tudor society, her birth barely made a ripple. Yet from these unassuming beginnings, something remarkable began to take shape. Anne's life would eventually tilt the course of English history. From an early age, she distinguished herself not by wealth, but by intellect and presence. Clever, spirited, and undeniably magnetic, she quickly recognized her own potential. Her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her formal education and exposure to European courts truly set her apart. And Boleyn's early education and courtly experience set her apart from almost any Englishwoman of her time. She first served Margaret of Austria at the dazzling court of the Netherlands, a rare opportunity that exposed her to the subtle arts of diplomacy, etiquette, and the intricate choreography of European politics. Yet it was in France that her talents truly blossomed. There, she spent several years in the refined courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, absorbing the sophisticated codes of influence, elegance, and wit. While other young women focused on needlework and polished conversation and mastered the subtler arts, flirtation, clever repartee, and the rare skill of commanding attention without appearing to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was no ordinary woman. She possessed the sophistication of a continental courtier while carrying the ambition and poise of a rising English family, and was not considered a conventional beauty by contemporary standards, but her presence was undeniable. Her dark, intelligent eyes held a spark that drew people in. Her voice, musical and lively, conveyed purpose, and her movements suggested a confidence and resolve barely concealed beneath her courtly grace. She didn't merely enter a room, she transformed it. At a time when a woman's fate was often determined by her birth and marriage prospects, and refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had witnessed the power of charm, wit, and intellect in the courts of Europe, and she intended to apply that knowledge at home. Though still young, clever, ambitious, and untested, and was already becoming a force around which history began to swirl. She returned to England not merely as the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, but as a woman ready to play a high-stakes game, one that would eventually involve the crown itself. In the English court, she was unlike any noblewoman the kingdom had encountered, surrounded by pale-faced, demure ladies, and was a storm of energy, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, piercing gaze, and sharp mind made her stand out immediately. Initially, she assumed the role expected of her, maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Yet even in the Queen's shadow, her presence was impossible to suppress. She danced with effortless grace, spoke French like a native, and laughed with a self-assurance that few women dared to display. Men noticed, women whispered. The court quietly buzzed about the remarkable Boleyn girl, and it was only a matter of time before she attracted the most perilous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. The Tudor court thrived on whispered promises, secret glances, and discreet entanglements. Yet Anne Boleyn was unlike any woman he had encountered. She did not swoon at compliments, nor did she fall willingly into his arms like so many before her. Instead, she provoked, challenged, and held her ground. Henry, accustomed to instant admiration and obedience, found himself utterly enthralled. The more she resisted, the deeper he fell under her spell. Their correspondence became a private storm of passion, longing, and occasional frustration. Henry offered her the position of royal mistress, the unofficial yet powerful seat at court that countless women had occupied before, and refused. She would not be a mere footnote in history, another forgotten mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his queen. It was a daring gamble, audacious enough to shock the entire court. The stakes were enormous. Henry was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, a beloved and formidable figure protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself stood as a formidable obstacle, yet and did not flinch. She had witnessed the courts of Europe, where queens wielded influence quietly yet decisively from behind lace fans and composed smiles. Ambition was dangerous, but she was determined to play the game and to win. in the candlelit halls of the English court and made her choice. She would not merely be admired, she would shape her destiny and England's future herself. What began as an intense courtship quickly escalated into a national crisis. Henry was no longer simply infatuated, he was consumed. And in his obsession, he was prepared to unravel centuries of tradition. The first obstacle was clear. He was married to Catherine, the dignified and resolute queen who had shared 2 decades of loyalty with him. In the eyes of God and the English people, Catherine was the rightful sovereign. Divorce was not merely scandalous, it was almost inconceivable. Yet Henry pressed on, claiming that his marriage had been invalid from the start because Catherine had once been wed to his brother Arthur, conveniently ignoring the papal dispensation that had permitted the union years earlier. And, for her part, knew better than to appear eager. She played the delicate game of ambition and restraint with skill, fully aware that the smallest misstep could cost her everything. And Boleyn maintained just enough distance to keep Henry on edge, balancing encouragement with deliberate restraint. Every look, every word, every gesture was carefully calculated. She wasn't merely pursuing marriage, she was maneuvering to become Queen of England. The court buzzed with whispers and scheming. Some noble families eagerly sought her favor, hoping to ride the rising tide of her influence. Others clung tightly to Queen Catherine, horrified at the thought of her being displaced. Ambassadors sent urgent reports back to Rome, while foreign monarchs threatened intervention. Henry's advisors grew increasingly uneasy, aware that the foundations of power were shifting beneath their feet. Frustration consumed the king. He pressed the Pope with relentless petitions, deployed lawyers to search for loopholes, and slowly realized that the Church's approval would not come easily. Catherine had powerful allies, most notably her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most formidable ruler in Europe. Yet Henry refused to relent. Defying precedent, tradition, and increasingly the law itself, his pursuit of and had evolved into more than personal desire. It was a direct challenge to England's political and religious order. In winning Anne, he risked dragging the entire kingdom into uncharted, perilous waters. The stakes were immense, and retreat was no longer an option. After nearly 7 grueling years of intrigue, scandal, and diplomatic wrangling, Anne's gamble bore fruit. In January 1533, she secretly wed Henry VIII, a daring act, as he was still legally married to Catherine in the eyes of Rome and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Yet triumph was far from unanimous. Londoners watched with a mix of awe, fear, and uncertainty. Some celebrated the new queen, while others whispered prayers for Catherine. Many wondered if Anne, with her continental manners and audacious spirit, was a blessing or a curse. She entered her queenship not as a universally adored figure, but as a storm sweeping through the English court, where Catherine had embodied traditional English virtues, humility, piety, and grace, and was daring, provocative, and politically shrewd. She commanded attention with vibrant clothing, sharp intelligence, and an unerring ability to make enemies just as quickly as she gained allies. Her position, while seemingly solid, was perilously fragile. All of her power, all of her influence, ultimately depended on one singular task, producing a male heir. And was no longer merely Henry's lover. She had become the linchpin of England's dynastic future. Early in her pregnancy, Anne Boleyn was the embodiment of dynastic hope. Henry was ecstatic, convinced that the child would be a boy to secure his lineage. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Despite the disappointment that must have burned within her, Anne concealed it with poise, assuring everyone that the next child would certainly be a son. Henry, however, was less restrained. The adoration in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. For a while, Anne Starr continued to shine brightly. She molded the English court to her vision, elevated her family to unprecedented power, and became the first queen in English history to be anointed with the sacred oil traditionally reserved for kings. Her influence extended far and wide. Foreign diplomats vied for her favor. Courtiers realigned themselves to secure her goodwill, and Henry's once obedient realm began its historic break from Rome, with the king at the helm of the newly established Church of England. Even so, Anne's crown was never entirely secure. Dark whispers circulated, rivals lurked in the shadows, and Henry, fickle and restless, already cast his gaze beyond the brilliant woman who had transformed the kingdom in his name. Retaining her position would require more than charm, ambition, or even Henry's love, and had ascended higher than nearly any woman of her era. But the higher the ascent, the steeper the fall. From the moment she wore the crown, cracks began to appear in her world. Central to her struggles was the relentless pressure to provide a male heir. Elizabeth, though healthy and vibrant, was not the son Henry's dynastic ambitions demanded, and endured successive pregnancies, each brimming with hope, only to be struck by devastating miscarriages that left her physically drained and emotionally wounded. Each loss chipped away at the foundations of her power. Henry, once passionately devoted, grew distant, the emotional rift widening between them. And, never one to remain silent, argued, demanded, and fought fiercely to maintain her place at court. But Henry, a man who prized both beauty and obedience, grew weary of her sharp wit, her defiance, the very fire that had initially captivated him. Meanwhile, enemies gathered like predators. Many nobles who had begrudgingly tolerated Anne's rise now openly plotted her downfall, and loyalists of Catherine of Aragon never forgave her, viewing her ascent as theft, sacrilege, and betrayal of tradition. Even the common folk murmured against her, branding her the great whore, blaming her for the break with Rome and the upheaval that followed. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, compliant, everything and was not. Jane drew Henry's attention just as Anne's influence began to fade. Where Anne had dazzled with wit, intelligence, and daring, Jane offered placid obedience. The shift was dangerous, imperceptive as ever, and saw it coming. She fought to regain her standing, showering Henry with attention, promising more sons, pleading for patience. But the king, ever capricious, had already begun envisioning a life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political foes, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, began orchestrating a campaign of destruction. Quietly, carefully, they collected accusations, rumors, and witnesses, waiting for the right moment. The woman who had navigated ambition with unparalleled skill was losing ground. She had claimed the crown through cunning and courage, yet in Henry's merciless court, past triumphs counted for nothing. Only new victories mattered. Anne's enemies sharpened their knives, and the queen who had once reshaped the kingdom would soon see how swiftly it could reshape her. Her downfall did not come through armies or open battle, but through whispers, secrets, and meticulously crafted lies in the hidden corners of court. Betrayal simmered silently, patiently, and deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's staunchest supporter in the English Reformation, turned against her. Their alliance had been forged on shared ambition, but now their goals diverged. Cromwell sought stability, favor with the king, and a smooth court, while Anne's boldness made her dangerously unpredictable. In Henry's fickle heart, love had soured into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Her once celebrated charm now grated against the court's appetite for a gentler, more compliant queen. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, lingered in the wings, the perfect foil to Anne's fading fire. Cromwell moved first, recognizing Henry's restlessness and desire for a convenient exit. He offered a solution: remove, and not through divorce, which would shame the king, but through disgrace. The charges were shocking and monstrous: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. The proud, brilliant queen was cast as a betrayer, a seductress, and a threat to the very crown she had once redefined. Cromwell meticulously gathered his evidence, pressuring confessions through intimidation and coercion, twisting innocent courtly flirtations into damning proof. Several men, including Anne's own brother George Bullen, were arrested alongside her. The accusations were absurd, filled with contradictions and impossibilities, yet in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king required it to be. And, sensing the tightening noose, pleaded desperately with Henry, invoking their past love and shared history. It was futile. The man who had once shattered England for her now refused even a glance. In May 1536, and was arrested and escorted to the Tower of London, the great gate clanging shut behind her. The truth was inescapable. She was no longer queen. She had become a prisoner, a pawn in the ruthless game she had once navigated so brilliantly. Alone in the tower, and awaited her fate. In the great hall, she faced a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their fortunes and positions to her rise. Now sitting in judgment, cold and detached, ready to erase the woman who had reshaped England's destiny. The charges were shocking: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, high treason, and conspiracy against the king. Accusations of this nature against a queen would have once been unimaginable. Now, they were merely theatrical devices, a dark performance designed to provide Henry with what he desired, and defended herself with the intelligence, precision, and poise that had once captured Henry's heart. She denied every allegation, citing her sacred coronation and anointing as Queen of England, her loyalty, sacrifices, and devotion. Yet it mattered little. The verdict had been preordained before she even entered the courtroom. The trial was both a court proceeding and a spectacle, a public dismantling of a woman who had once seemed invincible. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, delivered conflicting testimony. Evidence, when it existed, was flimsy at best. Truth was irrelevant, and was found guilty. Her brother George, along with the other accused men, was sentenced to death, destined to meet the executioner's blade by beheading. Compared to the usual fate of traitors, hanging, drawing, and quartering, and sentence was almost merciful. When the verdict was announced, she did not waver. Pale-faced but unbroken in spirit, she stood tall in the hall, declaring with calm resolve that she was ready to meet her end and praying for God's mercy on her soul. As the massive doors of the hall closed behind her, the gathered courtiers exhaled, believing the storm that was in Bullen, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. Yet even then, they failed to see the truth. They were not erasing her. Through betrayal, tragedy, and legend, and would endure. She was returned to the Tower of London not as the commanding queen who had once reshaped England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting her final hour. Even in the cold, echoing halls of the tower, she refused to break. Kneeling on the hard stone floors, hands tightly clasped, she spent hours in prayer. She confessed to no crimes, for she believed she had committed none. She accepted death with courage, praying that her passing would bring peace to the kingdom and, above all, protection and mercy for her young daughter, Elizabeth, and her loyal ladies-in-waiting. Those few who remained faithful wept in secret, yet it was, and who comforted them with quiet grace. Even in her darkest hours, she could summon a wry, bitter humor, noting that history might remember her as the queen who had lost her head. That stubborn spark, her wit and fire, was part of what made her unforgettable. Meanwhile, Henry VIII showed no sign of hesitation or remorse. His gaze had already shifted to Jane Seymour, planning his next marriage even before Anne's execution date was set. A final, piercing betrayal from the man who had once dismantled a kingdom for her. On the evening of May 18, 1536, Anne was informed that she would die the following morning. Sleep eluded her, but she spent her last hours in prayer, asking for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps even for herself, for the ambition and pride that had brought her to this fate. Henry, in a flicker of royal consideration, or perhaps conscience, had arranged for a skilled French swordsman to carry out the execution with precision, cleaner and swifter than the traditional axe. It was a small mercy, though perhaps more for the king's comfort than hers. At dawn, and dressed for her final moment in a somber yet dignified dark gray damask gown, trimmed with crimson, a symbol of both sacrifice and grace, facing the end with the same courage that had defined her life. She carefully pinned back her dark hair, tucking it beneath a modest cap, ready to face the blade with quiet composure as the cold morning mist drifted through the tower's courtyard. And Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleading. Only a final, resolute act of courage before history's unflinching judgment. The end had come, yet her story was far from over. On the morning of May 19, 1536, and Boleyn mounted the scaffold erected within the Tower of London. A small, hushed crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses. Even the ancient stone seemed to pause, holding its breath. Draped in her gray gown, she appeared thinner, her face pale yet calm, eyes steady, unshaken. There was no hysteria, no wailing. She met death with the same unyielding dignity that had once unsettled the kingdom. Her final words were brief and measured. She did not protest, nor did she accuse. Instead, she prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had forsaken her. Forgiveness, not bitterness, was her final gift. The French executioner, chosen for precision, stepped forward and knelt gracefully, hands folded in prayer, gaze lifted to the heavens. A white cloth was tied across her eyes. Still as stone, she awaited the inevitable. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and in Boleyn, queen, mother, and history maker, was no more. Her body was interred hastily in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, placed in a narrow chest, for no proper coffin had been prepared. The queen, once adorned in gold and crowned with majesty, vanished quietly into the cold earth. Yet her story did not end there. Her daughter, Elizabeth, born to a world that had once dismissed her, would rise to become one of England's most remarkable monarchs. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, would preside over an era of cultural flowering, political strength, and global influence. She inherited her mother's fierce spirit, keen intellect, and unbending resilience. And Boleyn's life reshaped England. Her ambition precipitated the break with Rome and the founding of the Church of England, while her tragic fall demonstrated that even queens were not immune to the ruthless currents of power. Yet through her bloodline, through Elizabeth, and Boleyn's influence outshone any crown she had worn in life. In the end, her immortality was forged not in survival, but in the lasting mark she left on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered with unrest, like a pot left too long over a roaring flame. Once loyal to Britain as a proud mother country, the colonies had grown bitter with resentment, suspicion, and mounting anger. The crisis hadn't begun with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had ignited outrage by imposing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law was dictated thousands of miles away by a parliament in which colonists had no voice. It was a spark landing on dry tinder. At first, anger expressed itself in petitions, pamphlets, and fiery essays. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests, merchants organized boycotts, and writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with impassioned arguments about liberty and rights. Yet over time, frustration deepened. The colonists realized Britain wasn't listening. Worse, it seemed Britain didn't care. Many held on to hope that reason, protest, and persistence could sway Parliament. And sometimes it worked. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after loud colonial objection. But every small triumph was quickly followed by new taxes, new laws, and new affronts. The issue wasn't the money, it was the principle. The colonies were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than partners, ruled as distant possessions. Boston became the epicenter of resistance. There, the Sons of Liberty, a secretive and defiant group of patriots, grew louder and bolder in 1770. Tensions erupted into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians, an event that would go down in history as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the city's cobblestones, and trust in Britain had evaporated. By 1773, the colonies teetered on the brink. One final insult could, and would, push them into open rebellion. That insult came not in soldiers or new taxes, but in the quiet, deceptively innocent form of crates filled with tea. On the night that tea was dumped into the icy waters of Boston Harbor, the world tipped into irreversible change. In 1773, Parliament made a serious misjudgment, assuming the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea. They passed the Tea Act, designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company and, at the same time, reaffirm Britain's authority to tax the colonies. On paper, it seemed reasonable. The act allowed the company to sell tea directly in the colonies, eliminating the middlemen, lowering prices, and offering a premium product for a few pennies less than usual. But the issue wasn't the cost. It was the principle. The Tea Act kept the contentious tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the discounted tea would mean conceding Parliament's right to levy taxes without colonial consent, a surrender of freedoms that many Americans had defended for over a decade. News of the Tea Act spread like wildfire. Merchants were furious, fearing the monopoly would ruin local trade. Patriots seethed at the implied message. The Crown believed it could impose its will unchecked. In Boston, the response was particularly intense. Already scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic strain, the city recognized the Tea Act as a trap, wrapped in the guise of a bargain. Rejecting the tea became a matter of principle, a test of loyalty to liberty. Public meetings swelled with protest, newspapers blazed with fiery editorials, and groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, orchestrated boycotts. They vowed that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or consumed in the colonies. Across the Atlantic coast, from New York to Charleston, resistance turned away arriving shipments. But Boston faced a unique standoff. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sat anchored in the harbor, ordered to unload their cargo. The colonists refused. A tense deadlock stretched on, each side unwilling to yield. Every moment the ships remained in port, the pressure mounted, until a single decisive act would ignite the confrontation. And the world was about to change forever. With the British tea ships stubbornly moored in Boston Harbor, the city had become a tense powder keg. Each passing day ratcheted up the pressure. Boston wasn't merely resisting, it was bracing for confrontation. In taverns, churches, and public squares, colonists debated furiously over the proper course of action. The Sons of Liberty, led by the impassioned voices of Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved quickly to organize coordinated defiance. They plastered public notices urging citizens to boycott British tea and held fiery meetings that drew farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Every gathering fanned the flames of resistance. The Old South Meeting House became the epicenter of this revolt. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in unified defiance. Resolutions were passed, speeches thundered, and tempers flared. Every vote to block the unloading of tea was another blow to British authority. Yet, even as Bostoners stood resolute, time was running out. British law required that imported goods, including tea, be unloaded and taxed within 20 days. If the ships lingered beyond that deadline, customs officials could seize the cargo and collect the tax by force. The Sons of Liberty knew that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle of colonial rights would be lost. This was no longer merely about tea. It was about asserting that the colonies could not be treated as subjects without voice, that they had the right to defend their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading, insisting that the law be upheld regardless of colonial outrage. To Hutchinson, yielding would mean admitting that mobs, not monarchy, held the true power in the colonies. The standoff in Boston became a citywide spectacle. Every resident, man, woman, and child, felt the palpable tension, the quiet anticipation before a storm. All it would take was a single decisive act to ignite the fuse. Among the crowded streets and anxious hearts, A plan was quietly taking shape, one that would resonate across oceans and empires. On the morning of December 16, 1773, a cold, gray dawn settled over Boston. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had waited in the harbor, ticking like quiet time bombs, as the city teetered on the edge of history. The fateful day had come. British law demanded that the tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of each ship's arrival. If the deadline was ignored, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be sent to enforce the law. Everyone in Boston understood the stakes. If the tea touched the docks, the colonists' claim to liberty and their fight for rights would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists crowded into the Old South Meeting House, the town's largest gathering place. Some had trudged for miles through icy roads just to be present. The hall overflowed. Men spilled into the streets, straining to catch the speeches echoing from within. Samuel Adams, the unyielding voice of rebellion, presided over the assembly. Speaker after speaker rose, denouncing the Tea Act, railing against tyranny, and urging immediate action. Yet, even amid the fervor, uncertainty lingered. How could they prevent the tea from landing without provoking outright war? How could they act decisively without triggering brutal retaliation? As the afternoon dragged on, riders arrived with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to budge. The tea would not leave the ships, the cargo would be seized, and the tax would be collected. The crowd bristled with outrage, the meeting house itself seeming to tremble under the collective fury. Then Samuel Adams spoke, his voice calm, yet final. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." The sentence hung in the air. Everyone knew its meaning. There would be no more petitions, no more appeals. The time for words was over. Action was inevitable. Quickly, men disguised themselves, blackening their faces with soot, draping crude blankets over their shoulders, and affixing feathers to imitate Mohawk warriors. The disguise was not meant to fool anyone. It was a statement, a symbol that left no room for misinterpretation. The deadline had passed. Boston would respond not with words, but with defiance. As twilight descended over the harbor on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets stirred. Shadowy figures moved with purpose. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, faces smeared with soot, feathers jutting from their heads, ready to take history into their own hands. The colonists weren't trying to convince anyone they were genuine Mohawks. The disguise was purely symbolic, a shedding of old identities, a declaration of a new, fierce purpose. By the dozens, they moved silently toward Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned dark and icy beneath them, thick with the bitter bite of winter. There was no shouting, no chaos. This was not a mob or a drunken brawl. It was a mission, executed with calm precision and steely focus. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised men swarmed the ships, quickly overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. The sailors were unharmed, held at a careful distance as the work began. Crates were split open with practiced blows, the fragrant aroma of tea spilling into the frigid night air. Others hoisted the chests over the sides, plunging them into the harbor. Chest after chest went overboard, 342 in total, until the dark water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators on the wharf watched in silence, awed by the discipline of the operation. The British guards, stationed nearby, did not intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalation remains unclear. Remarkably, even in a city where hunger and hardship were common, the colonists stole nothing. They targeted only the tea, the hated emblem of British oppression. No valuables were taken, no opportunistic looting occurred. The protest remained focused, deliberate, and symbolic. When the work was done, the harbor resembled a dark cauldron of torn crates and floating tea leaves, the smell of the sea mingling with the pungent scent of crushed tea. The men vanished into the shadows, slipping silently through Boston's alleys and back streets, leaving behind no names, no leaders, no claims to glory, only the unmistakable imprint of defiance. As the last crates bobbed in the cold water, the city seemed to pause, holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot, a fight, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, a deliberate, calculated act of resistance, carried out under the cover of night, that would echo across history. The harbor had become a churning, floating sea of tea. Thousands of pounds of East India Company cargo bobbed dark and soaked in the cold waters, a chaotic monument to defiance. Some curious or impulsive colonists tried scooping handfuls of the drenched leaves, only to be sternly rebuked by Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be taken. No profit, no spoils. This night belonged solely to principle. By morning, Boston awoke to the pungent scent of salty, wet tea lingering in the air. Word of the event spread like wildfire, by letter, by broadsheet, by whispers in taverns and workshops. Patriots celebrated with fierce pride that ordinary men had struck a blow against the mightiest empire on earth. Loyalists and moderates, however, saw horror and recklessness, fearing the colonies had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Governor Thomas Hutchinson seethed in his mansion, enraged not only at the destruction of property, but at the audacious message it sent. If the king's authority could be openly defied in Boston, where might rebellion flare next? British officials were stunned. They had expected petitions, boycotts, perhaps the occasional riot over taxation, but they had not anticipated disciplined, organized colonists systematically destroying tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without breaking a single window. The ship captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could only watch helplessly as their cargo sank beneath the waves. The financial loss tallied over £10,000, a fortune in 1773. Yet the true cost could not be measured in pounds or tea alone. It was a blow to trust, loyalty, and the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled the colonies by consent. On that night, something far more powerful emerged, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. Across the Atlantic, news of the Boston Tea Party reached London with shocking speed. British officials reacted with fury. This was no mere protest. It was a deliberate act of rebellion, a mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. When King George III received word, his fury was said to chill the room, a cold reminder that the empire would not tolerate open defiance. Parliament, already exasperated by years of colonial defiance, erupted in fury. They demanded swift and severe punishment, not just for Boston, but as a warning to all 13 colonies. The result was a series of draconian measures that Americans would soon dub the Intolerable Acts. The first strike came fast and hard, the Boston Port Act. In one devastating move, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the city's economic lifeline, until the cost of the destroyed tea was reimbursed and order restored. Ships were forbidden to enter or leave. Trade ground to a halt. Goods and provisions became scarce. Boston, once alive with activity and noise, fell silent, its docks ghostly and deserted. The punishment didn't end there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-rule, placing authority entirely in the hands of the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officers accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, reinforcing the idea that British authorities were untouchable. Meanwhile, soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the citizens they were meant to control, a stark reminder that rebellion would not be tolerated. Liberty, it seemed, was no longer on the menu. Yet Parliament's iron grip backfired. Instead of cowing the colonies, Boston's suffering sparked outrage and sympathy across America. Wagon loads of food and essential supplies poured into the city from neighboring colonies. Letters of support and declarations of unity circulated. Secret meetings multiplied. What had been a problem confined to Massachusetts now became a shared American cause. Britain had hoped to make an example of Boston. Instead, they had created a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The embers of rebellion, once isolated and fragile, now ignited across the colonies, spreading quickly and with unstoppable force. The flames of revolution, once faint, had begun to roar. The punishment inflicted on Boston reverberated far beyond Massachusetts' rocky coastlines. Across all 13 colonies, anger transformed into a force Britain could not easily contain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant relatives, divided by geography, commerce, and faith, often squabbling among themselves. But when Parliament shut down Boston's harbor and stripped Massachusetts of self-rule, colonists from Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire realized that no colony was safe. If Boston could be punished, any of them could be next. The response was immediate. Wagon loads of food, letters, and supplies flowed into Boston from across the colonies. Town meetings erupted with indignation. Printers worked day and night, spreading news and stoking outrage. The fight was no longer just Boston's. It had become a cause for all. And in September 1774, something unprecedented took place. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to coordinate a collective response. Figures like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once regional leaders, now emerged as architects of a movement swelling in strength. Officially, most still hoped for reconciliation, a return to mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the surface, a new understanding was forming. The Congress agreed to a coordinated boycott of British goods and pledged mutual support in the face of any further aggression. They declared that an attack on one colony would be treated as an attack on all. Across taverns, churches, and meeting houses, ordinary colonists began to speak words that had previously been whispered in private: unity, resistance, liberty. By attempting to crush Boston, Britain had unwittingly forged something far stronger than a single rebellious city. They had helped weld the colonies into a united front, a people beginning to see themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer whispers. They had become a gathering storm, unstoppable and inevitable. When the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't merely chests of cargo that were destroyed. It was the fragile illusion that the American colonies could remain obedient subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party ignited a spark no king, no distant parliament, no army could ever extinguish. In the months that followed, that spark spread like wildfire through the colonies. Petitions and boycotts hardened into open defiance. Town militias drilled openly in village greens. Powder and shot were stockpiled, and men who once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered of rebellion in the same rooms. Boston had become a symbol, a beacon of courage and sacrifice. The tighter Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped from its control. Every ship that sailed past Boston's shuttered, silent harbor was a reminder that tyranny had met its match in American resistance. Parliament had hoped the intolerable acts would cow the colonies into obedience, making an example of Boston. Instead, they had created a martyr city, a rallying cry stretching from Georgia to New Hampshire. Colonists realized their fates were now intertwined. The struggle was no longer just about tea. It had become a fight for identity, freedom, and survival. By spring 1775, tensions erupted into violence. At Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to seize colonial weapons were met by armed farmers, ordinary men standing ready to defend their rights. The first shots of the American Revolution echoed directly from the moment Boston patriots chose principle over profit, dumping fortunes in tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party proved that revolution doesn't always arrive with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it begins quietly, under the cover of night, with a determined few daring to defy fear itself. The colonists were no longer merely resisting taxes, they were rejecting an empire. And though the path ahead would be bloody, uncertain, and bitter, one truth was undeniable. By that cold December night in Boston Harbor, the American colonies had become something entirely new. They were no longer subjects. They were revolutionaries, and their fight had only just begun. Long before Stonehenge cast its silhouette against the English sky, Corral stood in quiet majesty, tucked away in the arid valleys along Peru's coast. Nearly 5,000 years ago, this city rose to prominence and then vanished almost entirely, buried beneath shifting sands and lost to memory. For centuries, the world had no inkling of its existence. The Soup Valley, where Corral once thrived, seems at first glance a harsh and unwelcoming landscape. The land is dry and barren, the river reduced to a slender silver thread winding through rock and dust. To any casual observer, it seemed inhospitable, a place forsaken by life. Yet in this seeming wasteland, one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations took root. Corral was not a mere cluster of huts or a transient trade outpost. It was a meticulously planned city, sprawling across 150 acres, complete with pyramids, plazas, residential zones, and ceremonial complexes. The city was built with purpose, vision, and scale. Its society flourished centuries before the Egyptians raised their iconic pyramids. The inhabitants of Corral accomplished this without the wheel, written language, or metal tools. Every structure arose through ingenuity, communal effort, and sheer human determination. And yet, for millennia, Corral remained hidden. Even travelers who passed through the valley mistook the weathered mounds for natural hills, sculpted by wind and time. Few imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the America's oldest cities, predating many civilizations' history, once called the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the city's secrets. What emerged from the dust transformed our understanding of the ancient Americas, challenging assumptions about the origins of urban civilization. Corral had risen, thrived, and fallen in silence. Yet now, after millennia, its stones speak again. They tell of a sophisticated, peaceful people who created a complex world in a place where survival seemed improbable. And even as these stories emerge, they mark only the beginning of Corral's remarkable tale. At first glance, the Soup Valley seems inhospitable, but it was here that human ingenuity first defied the odds. Harsh winds tore across the endless plains of sand and stone. The sun blazed mercilessly, cracking the earth and baking the land into brittle, lifeless sheets. Water was precious, scarce, a thin, twisting river struggling to survive. To an outsider, this was a wasteland, abandoned, unwelcoming, cursed by the gods. But the people of Corral saw something entirely different. They saw opportunity. They recognized the river, however modest, as a thread of life, a chance to transform the unforgiving land. With patience, ingenuity, and sheer will, they turned the desert into a flourishing hub of culture and civilization. Their first triumph was agriculture. They learned to control the river's seasonal floods, constructing simple yet ingenious irrigation systems that carried water across the valley where others saw only dust and sand. From this careful stewardship sprang life. Crops, cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes, took root. Cotton became particularly valuable, spun into fishing nets and textiles that fueled trade with coastal communities and forged connections far beyond their valley home. But their mastery extended beyond farming. The people of Corral knew that survival in such a harsh land demanded harmony with nature. They built homes and plazas from stone and earth, structures crafted to endure both the blistering sun and the rare but violent desert storms. They observed the stars, tracked the seasons, and planned harvests with the precision of skilled astronomers. Trade became the lifeblood of Corral, as dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handcrafted goods flowed up and down the coast. Exotic shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and ideas from distant peoples reached the city, proving it was far from isolated. Corral prospered not through conquest or domination, but through respect, understanding, and cooperation with the land. They learned its rhythms, harnessed its power, and built a society that was not merely functional, but vibrant, resilient, and remarkable. It was nothing short of extraordinary. Against all odds, Corral flourished into a shining example of early civilization, and this was only the beginning of its rise. Emerging from the desert like silent sentinels, the pyramids of Corral challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient societies in the Americas. These were not modest, hastily built structures. They were monumental works of architecture, crafted with vision, organization, and ambition. At the heart of the city stood the pyramids, with the largest towering over the desert. Stretching more than 450 feet in length and soaring nearly 60 feet above the ground. This was engineering on a scale rivaling the earliest wonders of the ancient world. Constructed from stone, mud, and woven reed bags packed with rocks, the pyramid was built not only to endure the harsh sun and wind, but also to withstand the occasional earthquakes that shook the region, and endure it did, standing resilient against time and the elements for almost 5 millennia. Yet the pyramids of Corral were not tombs. Unlike the monumental burial complexes of Egypt, these pyramids served as vibrant centers of ceremony, governance, and communal life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, accessible via broad, elegant staircases. Fires blazed atop these platforms, and rituals filled the plazas below, unfolding beneath the expansive Peruvian sky. The city's sunken and circular plazas invited thousands to assemble for religious ceremonies, political deliberations, and communal festivities. The layout of Corral reveals a society that valued community, order, and connection, not just with each other, but with the cosmos itself. Residential complexes radiated from the pyramids, likely housing priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The positioning of the pyramids themselves appears intentional, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, and the cycles of the stars. For the people of Corral, architecture was never purely practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, and cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones today, it's impossible not to feel awe. These structures rose without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. Yet they were constructed with staggering symmetry, scale, and precision, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. The Great Pyramids of Corral were never built for vanity or conquest. Their purpose was far loftier, to link Earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. Across the sands, their silent stones continue to whisper a story that refuses to fade. Within the ruins of Corral lies something remarkable, something that sets it apart from most ancient civilizations. No weapons lie buried beneath its soil. No defensive walls encircle its plazas. There are no mass graves hinting at bloody conquest or internal strife. Unlike kingdoms that rose and fell through violence, Corral thrived through peace. It is a revelation that challenges everything we expect of early societies. Here was a civilization that prospered not through war, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Corral devoted their energy to architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids were never monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and civic gathering. Corral was a society that chose to meet, to negotiate, and to exchange, rather than to destroy. Trade formed the lifeblood of its success. Cotton, cultivated along the fertile riverbanks, was spun into fishing nets and traded with coastal communities. In return, Corral received dried fish for protein, exotic goods from distant lands, colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and rare tropical fruits from faraway valleys. This expansive network wove together far-flung communities, creating a web of peaceful, mutual benefit with Corral at its heart. The city flourished as both a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life helped maintain social cohesion. The grand plazas and sunken courts likely served as stages for rituals uniting the people through shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums crafted from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert and tied individual lives to a greater whole. Leadership in Corral relied less on force and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. Its rulers coordinated massive construction projects, agricultural cycles, and complex trade networks, all without leaving behind the scars of war. In a world so often shaped by conquest, Corral stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization can rise on collaboration, ingenuity, and shared purpose rather than on the backs of the vanquished. Corral was not built through force or conquest, but through the quiet strength of collaboration, creativity, and trust. Its stones still seem to vibrate with echoes of a world long vanished. This was more than a city of buildings and trade. It was alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual pulsed through the very heartbeat of Corral civilization. Archaeologists carefully sifting through the desert sands uncovered a remarkable collection of ancient instruments. Flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, and small drums stretched with animal hides. These objects were not mere toys. They were meticulously crafted, tuned to carry sound across the wide-open plazas, designed for ceremonial resonance. In a society without written language, music spoke the words of the soul. Imagine the low hum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, hundreds of feet stamping in unison across sunken plazas. Fires would blaze atop the pyramid platforms as priests, clad in elaborately woven garments, chanted to the gods of river, earth, and stars. Corral was not merely a city, it was a living symphony. The very layout reflects a society centered on ritual. Grand plazas were stages for communal gatherings, while sunken circular courts functioned like natural amphitheaters, focusing sound and attention on ceremonies performed at their center. The pyramids towered above not as tombs, but as sacred mountains, linking earth to sky. Rituals likely marked the seasons, harvest cycles, and celestial movements. Music served as a bridge, connecting people, nature, and the divine, a conduit between the tangible and the mysterious. There were no violent murals, no gods of war, no bloody sacrifices. The spiritual world of Corral was one of harmony, reverence, and celebration. Even today, when the desert winds sweep through the ruins, one can almost hear the faint echoes of that ancient music, the songs of a people who discovered beauty, purpose, and connection at the heart of a harsh, unyielding landscape. Corral was far more than a center of music, trade, and ritual. It was a triumph of human ingenuity and engineering. In one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, the people of Corral shaped a city of stone and earth that has stood for nearly 5,000 years. Their accomplishments were staggering. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, crafted not from small bricks, but enormous stones transported across the arid valley. Workers moved the heavy rocks using reed bags, ingenious, woven baskets made from riverbank plants, layering stone carefully and filling the interiors with rubble. The result was monumental structures designed to endure both the passage of time and the fury of nature. Corral lay in a region prone to violent earthquakes, yet its pyramids and plazas remain largely intact. How did they achieve this? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders relied on flexible construction, wide foundations, and rounded corners, techniques that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. This engineering genius came not from manuals or textbooks, but from an intimate understanding of the land itself. Water management was another remarkable achievement. In a desert environment, the people of Corral engineered sophisticated canals and irrigation channels that guided river water to their fields, ensuring crops thrived even in dry seasons. Every drop was precious, and no water was wasted. The city's layout reflected a profound understanding of astronomy and urban planning. Major structures aligned with solar events. While sunken plazas were more than communal spaces, they functioned as observatories, helping priests and astronomers track the heavens and predict the seasons critical for survival. Residential areas, administrative zones, and ceremonial centers were arranged in harmonious balance, blending daily life with sacred spaces. The people of Corral built not just for their own time, but for generations yet to come. Modern engineers studying the site marvel at its resilience, a reminder that true mastery is not measured solely by technology. Greatness can emerge from understanding nature and working with its rhythms rather than against them. The stones of Corral have withstood storms, earthquakes, and the slow erosion of time, a lasting testament to human vision, patience, and skill. They stand as silent witnesses to a civilization that etched its dreams into the desert. For centuries, Corral thrived, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural brilliance amid the harsh sands. And then, almost imperceptibly, it was abandoned. No fires marked a violent end. No scars of conquest marred its walls. No mass graves or shattered monuments told of catastrophe. Corral simply faded. Its plazas emptied, pyramids abandoned, flutes and drums silenced by the relentless march of time. Why did its people leave? That question still haunts the Super Valley like a lingering shadow. Some scholars point to environmental pressures. Evidence of prolonged drought suggests the river's life-giving waters may have faltered, crippling agriculture. Crops withered, and trade networks built on surplus cotton, fruits, and fish may have collapsed. Other theories suggest shifting trade routes or the rise of neighboring powers gradually eroded Corral's influence. The city that once supplied the coast with cotton, fish, and produce may have lost its economic dominance, slowly bleeding its vitality. Some whisper of internal decline, political disputes, religious shifts, or simple societal exhaustion. Even the most peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the abandonment appears to have been gradual rather than sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking richer valleys, stronger rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran through Corral's plazas grew up recounting stories of a lost city, tales that over generations faded into legend. The desert reclaimed what humanity had built. Winds swept sand over stone temples. Flutes and drums lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a vibrant, humming civilization became a field of silent mounds for nearly 4 millennia. Corral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting for archaeologists to rediscover its stones and resurrect the story of a remarkable city long forgotten. The question lingers: how could a city so advanced, so meticulously built, simply disappear? Perhaps the answer lies in the fragile nature of even the greatest civilizations. No matter how wise, peaceful, or creative, they are but threads in the vast tapestry of time, vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For thousands of years, Corral lay forgotten, buried beneath the quiet sands of the Super Valley. Travelers passed over the rounded, wind-sculpted hills, unaware that beneath their feet rested the remnants of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To the untrained eye, these were mere natural mounds, shaped by desert winds and centuries of erosion. It was not until the late 20th century that Corral's voice would be heard again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Super Valley, drawn by curiosity and the suspicion that these hills held ancient secrets. What they unearthed would rewrite the story of civilization in the Americas. Layer by careful layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of precisely cut stone, broad staircases, sunken plazas, and towering pyramids. A city far older than anyone had imagined. Radiocarbon dating revealed the astonishing truth. Corral was more than 4,600 years old, thriving alongside the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The discovery sent shockwaves through archaeology, challenging the long-held belief that complex societies in the Americas appeared only centuries later, overshadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that monumental architecture, organized urban life, and sophisticated social systems had emerged independently in the Americas long before the rise of the Maya or the Inca. Ruth Shady and her team uncovered more than stone structures. They found traces of everyday life. Musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, intricate knot records, and offerings to the gods. Every artifact told a story of ingenuity, creativity, and foresight. Corral's rediscovery was not just an academic achievement, it was a resurrection. A civilization that had slumbered beneath the desert for millennia now stood revealed beneath the open sky, its plazas caressed by the same winds that once carried the melodies of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is celebrated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, invaluable window into humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. For centuries, the desert sands concealed Corral, hiding its pyramids, plazas, and streets from the eyes of the world. Yet the stones endured, patient and silent, waiting for someone to see, to listen, to remember. Today, Corral stands as a quiet giant, a testament to the deep and enduring roots of civilization. Within its ancient plazas and towering pyramids, the stones still whisper a story that reshapes how we understand humanity's journey. Not a story of conquest or bloodshed, but one of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the empires of Greece, Rome, or Egypt reached their heights, the people of Corral were constructing monumental pyramids without the wheel and mapping the heavens without written records. They cultivated a society built on trade, ritual, music, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers an alternative vision of civilization, a community that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It shows us that true greatness lies not in armies or battles, but in the ways people come together to build, to create, to dream. Corral's legacy stretches far beyond the arid sands of the Super Valley. It challenges the long-held idea that civilization had a single cradle, proving that monumental architecture and urban complexity arose independently across the globe. Different lands, different hands, yet the same timeless human desire to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Walking among the weathered ruins today, it is almost possible to hear the pulse of drums, the haunting call of flutes, the chatter of traders in the plazas, the laughter of children racing along stone alleys beneath the endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories remain etched into the very bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fade, their spirit can endure, sleeping beneath the sands, waiting to inspire again. In the grand sweep of human history, Corral shines not only as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. Even in the harshest deserts, under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and rise to build a world that reaches for the stars.